They grabbed my son and told me this seat wasn't mine. The boarding pass trembled in my fingers. The seat numbers 2A and 2B printed clearly in bold black ink, but the flight attendant's eyes cut through me like I'd committed some unforgivable crime. My 4-year-old son, Max, clutched my hand so tightly I could feel his pulse racing against my palm, his wide eyes filling with the kind of fear that breaks a parent's heart into 1,000 jagged pieces. "Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the cabin's low hum. And I wanted to answer him, wanted to tell him everything would be fine, but the words stuck in my throat like shards of glass. "Sir, you don't understand. Economy passengers accidentally wander into first class all the time. Please cooperate with us," the woman said, her smile so artificial it looked painful to maintain. I held up my boarding pass, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is my seat, 2A and 2B. You can see it right here." But her gaze traveled over me again. A slow, deliberate assessment from my worn gray hoodie, to my faded jeans, to my exhausted face. In her calculation, I clearly didn't belong in this cabin with its leather seats and complimentary champagne. The Omega designation wasn't tattooed on my forehead, but somehow my silence, my downcast eyes, my entire presence seemed to broadcast it to everyone watching. I'd learned long ago that fighting only made things worse, that keeping quiet and accepting your place was the safest way to survive in a world designed for alphas. My scent started to betray me, that telltale sweet vanilla and lavender that intensified whenever stress flooded my system. I knew people could detect it, could smell the Omega anxiety rolling off me in waves. The alphas in the first row lifted their heads like predators catching wind of prey. Some turned away in disgust, as if my mere presence contaminated their air. Others smirked, their expressions loaded with the kind of judgment I'd seen my entire life. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack them. "Ma'am, please," I managed, though my voice shook despite my best efforts. "My son is exhausted. We purchased these tickets legally." "You cannot sit here," she interrupted, her tone sharpening. "Boarding passes sometimes have system errors. We've received instructions to move you to economy class where you belong." Max looked up at me, his small face full of questions I had no idea how to answer. How could I explain that the world measures your worth by designations you can't control? That being born an alpha grants automatic respect while being an omega means fighting for basic dignity at every turn? That some people would always see us as less than, no matter what we did or how hard we tried. I started gathering our small carry-on bag, my hands shaking as I lifted it onto my shoulder. Fighting wasn't in my nature. I'd been conditioned my whole life to know my place, to bow my head and endure whatever treatment came my way. Max's eyes held questions I couldn't bear to face, confusion mixing with the fear that his mama couldn't protect him from this humiliation. The other passengers watched our forced exit like it was entertainment, some with pity, most with indifference. Then suddenly everything changed. The cockpit door opened, an alpha emerged, and the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. He was tall, with broad shoulders that filled out his crisp pilot's uniform perfectly, moving with the kind of quiet authority that made people instinctively straighten in their seats. His presence commanded the space without him saying a word. His scent hit me like a physical force, cedarwood and rain, sharp and clean and so intensely alpha that my knees nearly buckled. I knew who he was before I even looked up, before I saw the captain's insignia on his uniform. The captain. When his gray-blue eyes found mine, something in my chest shifted. For the first time in my life, someone seemed to actually see me, not as an omega to be dismissed, not as a problem to be solved, but as a person who mattered. His gaze held mine for just a moment, but that moment stretched and deepened until I felt like I was falling into something vast and unexplored. The cabin had gone completely silent. Even the passengers who'd been whispering stopped mid-sentence. The flight attendant's confident posture wavered, her artificial smile flickering like a dying light. She hadn't expected this, hadn't prepared for the captain himself to step into her perfectly orchestrated removal of an unwanted omega and his child. Max pressed closer to my leg, his small body seeking shelter, and I wrapped my arm around his shoulders instinctively. My heart was still racing, but now it wasn't just from fear and humiliation. Something else had entered the mix, something I couldn't quite name but that made my skin feel too tight and my breath come too fast. The captain's jaw was set, his expression unreadable but intense as he took in the scene. Me standing with my bag, Max clinging to me, the flight attendant blocking our seats, the other passengers watching like we were actors in a play they hadn't paid to see. His hands flexed at his sides, and I noticed details I shouldn't have been focusing on. The way his uniform fit perfectly across his chest, the strong line of his throat, the controlled power in every movement. He started walking toward us, each step measured and deliberate, and the flight attendant's face went pale. She opened her mouth, probably to explain, to justify, to make excuses, but he held up one hand and he fell silent. Immediately, that gesture alone told me everything about his authority, about the respect his presence commanded. My omega instincts were screaming at me. Part of me wanted to submit, to lower my eyes and wait for an alpha to decide my fate like I'd been taught. But another part, the part that had survived abandonment and raised Max alone, refused to cower. I lifted my chin slightly, meeting his gaze even though every nerve in my body told me to look away. His eyes were extraordinary up close. Not just gray-blue but flecked with silver, like storm clouds shot through with lightning. They focused on me with an intensity that made me feel simultaneously exposed and protected. I couldn't read his expression, couldn't tell if he was angry at the disruption or at me for causing it. Then his gaze shifted to Max, and something in those storm cloud eyes softened in a way that made my throat tighten. Max peeked out from behind my leg, his fear warring with curiosity as he looked up at this commanding alpha who seemed to fill the entire first-class cabin with his presence. The moment stretched, tension coiling tighter and tighter until I thought something had to break. And then the captain spoke, his voice deep and controlled, cutting through the silence like thunder rolling across a summer sky. The captain's gaze moved from me to Max, then landed on the flight attendant with the weight of judgment. His voice was deep and controlled, carrying an edge that made everyone in the cabin sit up straighter. "What's happening here?" The flight attendant immediately shifted her tone, her previous condescension melting into professional deference. "Sir, just a seating issue. System error with the—" "Show me the boarding pass," he commanded, extending his hand. He took the pass from my trembling fingers, and when his skin brushed against mine, electricity shot up my arm. The brief contact lasted maybe 2 seconds, but I felt it everywhere. His alpha scent intensified, filling my senses until I could barely think straight, and the omega in me, the part I'd spent years learning to suppress and control, responded in ways that terrified me. I quickly lowered my gaze, not wanting anyone to see how much his proximity affected me, how my body was betraying every wall I'd built. He examined the boarding pass with careful attention, then looked at his crew member. "This is valid. 2A and 2B. First class. Confirmed." "But sir," I was told. "By whom?" The edge in his voice sharpened to something dangerous. Silence fell like a hammer. The flight attendant had no answer. Her confidence evaporated, leaving behind only uncomfortable stammering and averted eyes. She'd clearly been acting on assumptions rather than actual protocol, and now those assumptions were crumbling under the captain's scrutiny. He turned back to me, and this time his expression held a softness that completely contradicted his commanding presence. "Are you okay?" I couldn't speak. My mind was a tangle of shame, anger, fear, and something else I refused to acknowledge. No one had asked me that question in so long that hearing it now felt surreal. Alphas didn't ask omegas if they were okay. They gave orders, made demands, took what they wanted. This simple question shattered something inside me. "Max, bless his honest heart," said quietly. "Mama's scared." The captain crouched down to Max's eye level, his entire demeanor transforming. The commanding authority remained, but it was wrapped now in genuine warmth. "Hey buddy, what's your name?" "Max." "Nice to meet you, Max. I'm Matthew." Then he looked up at me and I swear my heart stopped beating. "And your mom is safe here. I promise." My heart stopped. Matthew. The name imprinted itself on my brain like a brand, like something I'd never be able to forget even if I tried. It wasn't just a name anymore. It was a turning point, a before and after, a line drawn in the sand of my carefully controlled life. He stood up, every movement fluid and powerful, and addressed his crew with unmistakable authority. "Make sure they're comfortable. If anyone disturbs them, you report directly to me." Then he gave me the smallest smile, barely visible but enough to crack every defensive wall I'd spent years building. "Thank you," I whispered, though my voice was so faint I wasn't sure he heard it. Matthew started toward the cockpit, but before disappearing through that door, he looked back at me one more time. That look held concern and protection and something deeper I couldn't name. And I knew with absolute certainty that something fundamental had shifted. Not just the atmosphere in the cabin, but something inside me that had been frozen for so long I'd forgotten it could thaw. When he vanished into the cockpit, I finally let myself breathe. I settled Max into his seat, buckling him in with shaking hands, then collapsed into my own seat. My heart was still racing, pounding against my ribs like it was trying to escape. My mind kept replaying Matthew's gentle tone, the way he'd looked at Max, the promise he'd made. The flight attendant returned, her attitude completely transformed. "Can I get you anything? Water? Juice for your son? We have snacks available." "We're fine," I said, not trusting myself to say more. She nodded quickly and retreated, leaving us alone. The other first-class passengers had returned to their magazines and laptops. The entertainment over, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. Still being judged. Max tugged on my sleeve. "Mama, I like Captain Matthew. He's nice." "Yes, baby. He is." "Is he your friend now?" The question was so innocent, so childlike in its simplicity, but it hit me like a punch to the gut. Friend? Was that what this was? I barely knew the man. He'd intervened on our behalf. Yes, but that was his job, wasn't it? Making sure passengers were treated fairly? It didn't mean anything beyond professional courtesy, except his eyes had said otherwise. The way he'd looked at me, the softness in his voice when he promised we were safe, that went beyond professional. That was personal. I pushed the thought away, focusing instead on making sure Max was comfortable. I pulled out his favorite stuffed dinosaur from our bag, the one he'd had since he was a baby, and he clutched it to his chest with a contented sigh. The plane began taxiing toward the runway, engines rumbling to life beneath us. I stared out the window at the airport buildings sliding past, trying to calm my racing thoughts. This was just a flight. Matthew was just doing his job. In a few hours we'd land, go our separate ways, and I'd never see him again. But then the intercom crackled to life and his voice filled the cabin. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Matthew Reed speaking. Welcome aboard Flight 847 to Denver. We'll be cruising at an altitude of 35,000 feet, with an expected flight time 3 hours and 40 minutes. Weather looks clear, so we're anticipating a smooth journey." His voice was different over the intercom, professional, measured, calm, but I could still hear the underlying warmth, the strength that had commanded the cabin earlier. And hearing him introduce himself fully, Captain Matthew Reed, made him feel more real somehow, more tangible. "I want to personally assure all our passengers that your comfort and safety are our top priorities today. My crew and I are committed to making sure everyone has an excellent experience. If you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask." I wondered if that last part was directed at me, or if I was reading too much into everything. Probably the latter. I had a terrible habit of seeing meaning where none existed, of hoping for connections that would never materialize. The plane turned onto the runway, engines building to a roar. Max pressed his face to the window, watching the ground speed past as we accelerated. I gripped the armrests, my knuckles white, as I lifted off. Flying had never been my favorite activity, but with Max beside me and Matthew's voice still echoing in my head, I felt safer than I had in years. As we climbed through the clouds, I let myself close my eyes and take a deep breath. Whatever happened next, at least for now, we were okay. We were safe. And maybe, just maybe, that was when. The flight was smooth, but my heart was anything but calm. Max had fallen asleep against my shoulder, his small hand clutching my shirt like he was afraid I might disappear if he let go. I stared out the window at the endless expanse of blue sky dotted with white clouds, beautiful but somehow lonely, while my mind remained fixated on the captain, on Matthew. His name kept circling through my thoughts like a song I couldn't stop humming, persistent and impossible to ignore. I'd never expected an alpha to look at me the way he had, with protection instead of possession, with respect instead of dismissal, with something that almost felt like recognition, like he'd seen past the Omega designation to the person underneath, the one who'd been invisible for so long. A shadow fell across my seat, pulling me from my thoughts. Matthew stood in the aisle and my heart launched into my throat. I sat up straighter instinctively, my free hand moving to smooth down my hair, a nervous gesture that accomplished nothing. Why did I care what I looked like? This was ridiculous. He was the captain. I was just a passenger. This didn't mean anything. Mind if I sit for a second, he asked, keeping his voice low so he wouldn't wake Max. I could only nod, words completely failing me. My throat had gone dry. He settled into the empty seat across from me, probably reserved for the co-pilot during breaks. But he didn't seem concerned about protocol. His presence overwhelmed the small space, making me hyper-aware of every detail, his hands resting on his thighs, long fingers and a sleek watch catching the cabin lights. The way his uniform fit across his shoulders, the subtle movements of his breathing. "What's your name?" he asked gently, his gray-blue eyes focused entirely on me. "Lonnie." I managed, hating how weak my voice sounded. He smiled, small but genuine, reaching his eyes. "Lonnie. That's beautiful." Heat flooded my face. I dropped my gaze to my lap, unable to maintain eye contact. Everything felt too intense, too much, like standing too close to a fire. "I'm sorry about what happened earlier," he said. "That shouldn't have happened to you. I wanted to make sure you were actually comfortable, not just settled." "It's okay," I said quickly, defaulting to the response I'd been trained to give. "Don't make waves. Don't be a burden. Accept whatever treatment comes your way and be grateful it wasn't worse." "No." His voice was firm but not harsh. "It's not okay. You deserve respect. Both you and Max. Your ticket was valid, and you should have been seated without question or drama." Something cracked inside me at those words. I wanted to cry, wanted to let out all the hurt and frustration I'd been carrying for so long. But Max was right here and I needed to stay strong. I closed my eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, held it together. "Lonnie, look at me." It took courage I didn't know I had, but I raised my eyes to meet his. Those storm cloud eyes held depth and warmth and something unspoken that made my chest tighten. "You're safe with me," he said simply. "Okay?" And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I believed someone. Actually believed that maybe I could trust him. It felt like someone had finally seen me, truly seen me, not as an omega to be managed or dismissed, but as a human being who mattered. The feeling was so overwhelming I couldn't speak, could only give a small nod of acknowledgement. Matthew smiled and stood, his movements careful not to disturb Max. "Rest. I'll check on you both later." As he walked back toward the cockpit, I found myself watching him go, my heart still caught on everything he'd said. The hours passed in a strange blur. Max woke up eventually, groggy and confused about where we were until I reminded him we were flying to Denver to start our new life. New city, new apartment, new beginning. Or at least, that was the plan. The reality was far less certain. I had maybe 2 months of rent saved, no job lined up and a mountain of anxiety about how we'd survive. But every time my thoughts spiraled into panic, I'd remember Matthew's words. "You're safe with me." It shouldn't have meant as much as it did. He was a stranger who'd shown basic human decency. That was all. Nothing more, except it felt like more. The intercom crackled again and Matthew's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Denver International Airport. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for landing." My stomach dropped, not from the descent but from the realization that this flight was ending. In less than 30 minutes we'd land, disembark, and I'd never see Matthew again. He'd return to his life of flying across the country and I'd disappear into mine of struggling to make ends meet in a city where I knew no one. The thought hurt more than it should have. Landing was smooth, Matthew's skill evident in how gently the wheels touched down. As the plane taxied to the gate, passengers began gathering their belongings, eager to disembark. I took my time, letting Max wake up fully, gathering our few possessions. When the cabin had mostly cleared, I finally stood, lifting our bag onto my shoulder. Max held my hand sleepily, rubbing his eyes with his other fist. And then Matthew was there again, emerging from the cockpit as if he'd been waiting for everyone else to leave. "Need help?" he offered. "I'm okay." I lied. I was exhausted, mentally and physically drained from the stress of the flight and the uncertainty of what came next. He didn't argue, but he also didn't leave. Instead, he crouched down and spoke directly to Max. "Hey buddy, Did you have a good flight? Max nodded, then surprised me by asking, "Are you really a captain?" "I really am. I fly planes all over the country." "That's cool," Max said with the kind of awe only a 4-year-old could muster. "Maybe I'll be a captain someday." "I bet you will," Matthew said seriously, treating Max's declaration with complete respect. Then he straightened and looked at me. "Lonnie, can I ask you something?" My heart started racing again. "Yes, do you have plans? Here in Denver, I mean. Family? Support?" I laughed, and it came out bitter and hollow. "Plans to survive, mostly. Find work, pay rent, get Max into preschool. Nothing concrete beyond that." Matthew was quiet for a moment, something working behind his eyes. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. Simple, professional, embossed with his name. "This is my number," he said. "If you need anything, work references, connections, help with Max, anything at all, call me." I stared at the card. Captain Matthew Reed, followed by a phone number and email address. "I'm not a charity case," I said, defensive walls going up automatically. "I know you're not." His voice was so sincere it hurt. "But you don't have to do everything alone, Lonnie. That's all I'm saying. You're allowed to accept help." I took the card with trembling fingers. "Thank you." He smiled and it transformed his entire face. "Take care of yourself, both of you." We walked off the plane together, and at the gate he crouched down one more time to say goodbye to Max. "See you around, buddy." "Bye, Captain Matthew," Max said, waving enthusiastically. As we walked toward baggage claim, I clutched that business card like a lifeline. I told myself it was just politeness, just a kind gesture that meant nothing. But deep down I knew better. Something had started on that flight. Something I wasn't ready to name but couldn't ignore. The flight had been cruising smoothly for over an hour when I finally allowed myself to relax. Max was still asleep against my shoulder, his breathing soft and steady, one small hand curled around the armrest. I'd closed my eyes, trying to rest for just a few minutes, when the announcement crackled through the cabin speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing some unexpected turbulence ahead. Please return to your seats immediately and fasten your seatbelts." Matthew's voice was calm and composed, that professional tone designed to reassure passengers, but I caught something underneath it, a tension that told me this was serious. Then it started. The plane began to shake gently at first, just a slight vibration that could have been normal flight movement. But within seconds it intensified, the aircraft bucking and dropping as we hit invisible pockets of disturbed air. The cabin lights flickered once, twice, and overhead compartments rattled ominously. Someone's bag fell from an open bin with a heavy thud. Gasps of fear rippled through the cabin. Max jerked awake with a frightened cry, his fingers immediately clutching at my arm. "Mama, what's happening?" His voice trembled with pure terror. "It's all right, sweetheart. Just turbulence. We're completely safe," I said, pulling him close, but my own voice lacked conviction. My heart was hammering and my hands had gone cold with fear. The plane dropped suddenly, a sickening lurch that made my stomach flip, and Max screamed, burying his face against my chest. His whole body shook with sobs. I wrapped both arms around him, pressing my cheek to the top of his head, murmuring reassurances I didn't believe while my own panic threatened to overwhelm me. Then the cockpit door opened. Matthew emerged, moving through the unstable cabin with practiced ease, and somehow his mere presence changed the atmosphere. The panicked whispers quieted slightly. He made another announcement, his voice projecting that same professional calm, but when his eyes found mine across the rows of seats, his expression shifted into something more personal. He walked straight toward us, navigating the turbulence like it was nothing, and crouched beside my seat. "Lonnie," he said my name, and there was such genuine concern in his voice that my breath caught. "Give me your hand." "What?" I stammered, confused. He reached out and took my hand in his grip gentle but absolutely steady, and my racing heartbeat somehow accelerated even further. His alpha scent wrapped around me, still that cedarwood and rain, but now there was something deliberately calming woven through it, like he was consciously adjusting his pheromones to help soothe my panic. "Breathe with me," he instructed, his storm cloud eyes locked on mine. "Slow and steady. In and out." I followed his lead, matching my breathing to his, and gradually the terror receded. The plane was still shaking, turbulence still battering us, but somehow it faded into background noise. All that mattered was Matthew's hand holding mine, his eyes anchoring me, his presence creating a bubble of safety in the chaos. Max had stopped crying, watching Matthew with wide, wet eyes. Even at 4 years old, he seemed to sense that this alpha could be trusted. The turbulence finally subsided, the plane smoothing out as we emerged from whatever weather system had caught us. But Matthew didn't immediately release my hand. He stayed there, crouched beside me, his thumb brushing almost absently across my knuckles. "Better?" he asked softly. "Yes. Thank you," I whispered. He smiled, just a slight curve of his lips. "I couldn't leave you to go through that alone." Something in my chest cracked open at those words. When was the last time someone had cared whether I went through something alone? When had anyone ever chosen to stay with me instead of leaving me to handle things by myself? His expression grew more serious, thoughtful. "Lonnie, can I ask you something personal?" My throat went dry. "Okay. Max's father, is he in the picture? Do you have a partner?" The question shouldn't have hurt, but it did. I gently withdrew my hand from his, not rudely, just needing a bit of space to answer. "No, not anymore. He left when he found out I was expecting." The words tasted bitter. He said omegas were good for one thing, and raising children wasn't it, especially not alone. He used me and then threw me away like I was nothing. Matthew's jaw clenched, muscles tightening visibly. Anger flashed in his eyes, not directed at me, but for me. "He's the biggest fool I've ever heard of." Tears pricked at my eyes, but I blinked them back furiously. I refused to cry, refused to appear weak in front of this strong, kind alpha who'd already seen too much of my vulnerability. "You're so much stronger than you realize, Lonnie," Matthew said, and his voice held absolute conviction. "What you've done, raising Max on your own, surviving everything you've been through, that takes incredible courage. Max is extraordinarily lucky to have you as his parent." The tears came anyway, silent and hot, sliding down my cheeks before I could stop them. For so long I'd believed I wasn't enough, that my inability to keep Max's father meant I'd failed somehow. But Matthew was looking at me like I was something valuable, something worthy of respect and admiration. "I should get back to the cockpit," he said reluctantly, standing. "But I meant what I said earlier. You're not alone, Lonnie. Remember that." He walked away, disappearing through that door again, but his words stayed with me, and my hand, where he'd held it, still felt warm from his touch, a warmth that seemed to spread through my entire body, thawing parts of me I'd thought were frozen forever. Max snuggled against me again, his fear forgotten. "I like Captain Matthew, Mama. He makes you smile." Did I smile? I hadn't even realized. But maybe Max was right. Maybe Matthew had managed to crack through defenses I'd built so carefully over the years. The rest of the flight passed without incident. I stared out the window, watching clouds drift by, but my mind kept replaying every word Matthew had said, every look he'd given me. This was dangerous territory. I couldn't afford to develop feelings for an alpha I'd just met, someone who lived a completely different life than mine. But my heart didn't seem to care about logic. It had already started falling, and I had no idea how to stop it. When the plane began its final descent, I felt an unexpected sadness. Landing meant this was ending. Whatever this was, Matthew would return to his captain's life, flying across the country, meeting countless people. I was one passenger among thousands he'd helped over the years, except the way he'd looked at me suggested I was more than that. And that terrified me almost as much as it gave me hope. The landing was flawless. Matthew had delivered on his promise of a safe flight. When the plane came to a complete stop and the seatbelt sign chimed off, passengers immediately began gathering their belongings, everyone eager to disembark. But I moved slowly, carefully, because Max had fallen asleep again on my shoulder, exhausted from the emotional turbulence earlier. I didn't want to wake him if I could avoid it. Matthew appeared from the cockpit, still in his crisp uniform, though I could now see faint signs of fatigue around his eyes. It had been a long flight, but when he spotted me struggling to manage both Max and our carry-on, that same softness entered his expression. "Need help?" he offered, already reaching out. "I've got it," I said automatically, but it was a lie. I was exhausted, mentally and physically drained from stress and fear and the strange emotional roller coaster this flight had become. Without waiting for further protest, Matthew gently lifted Max from my arms, cradling my son against his chest with such natural ease that my heart ached. Max didn't even wake. just settled against the Alpha's shoulder with a contented sigh. People stared as we walked through the cabin together. An Alpha captain carrying an Omega's child, walking side by side like we were something more than strangers. But Matthew paid them no attention whatsoever, his focus entirely on navigating us safely off the plane. At the baggage claim area, he finally stopped, shifting Max slightly in his arms to look at me directly. "Lonnie, can I ask where you're headed from here? Do you have family waiting? Friends in Denver?" I let out a hollow laugh that held no humor. "My plan is to survive, basically. Find a job before my savings run out. Get Max enrolled in preschool next month. Figure out how to make rent." I shrugged, trying to appear casual. Nothing concrete. Just taking it one day at a time. Matthew's expression grew thoughtful, almost troubled. He stood there for several long moments, clearly wrestling with something internal. Then he carefully reached into his jacket pocket with his free hand and extracted a business card. "This has my personal cell number," he said, offering it to me. "If you need anything, job references, connections in Denver, childcare recommendations, or just someone to talk to, please call me." I took the card, reading the embossed text, "Captain Matthew Reed," followed by a phone number and email address. My hands were shaking. "I appreciate the gesture, but I'm not looking for charity," I said, defensive walls rising automatically. I'd learned long ago that accepting help always came with strings attached. "This isn't charity." His voice was so sincere it hurt to hear. "Lonnie, you're not alone anymore. I want you to understand that. I'm offering help because I see your strength, your dedication to Max. You deserve to have someone in your corner. Not because you need rescuing, but because everyone deserves support." The card felt heavy in my palm, weighted with possibility and risk in equal measure. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know me." "Maybe I want to change that," he said simply. Max began to stir, and Matthew carefully transferred him back into my arms, his movements so gentle and practiced that I wondered if he had children of his own. But he wore no wedding ring, and something told me he would have mentioned a family if he had one. "Goodbye, Max," Matthew said, ruffling my son's hair affectionately. Max blinked sleepily up at him. "Bye, Captain Matthew. Will I see you again?" "I hope so, buddy." We started walking toward the exit, but I couldn't resist looking back. Matthew stood exactly where we'd left him, hands in his pockets, watching us go. The expression on his face was complex, hope and longing and something almost like regret, all tangled together. In the taxi, Max curled against my side while I studied that business card, running my thumb over the raised letters of Matthew's name. My practical side screamed that this was a terrible idea, that getting involved with an Alpha would only lead to heartbreak. But another part of me, the part that had felt seen and valued for the first time in years, wanted desperately to believe this could be different, that Matthew could be different. The card went into my wallet, tucked carefully behind my expired library card and Max's first ultrasound photo. I told myself I probably wouldn't use it, that this was just Matthew being kind to a struggling Omega and nothing more. But I was lying to myself, and somewhere deep down I knew it. Our tiny studio apartment was exactly as depressing as I'd left it. Bare walls, secondhand furniture, a mattress on the floor that Max and I shared. But it was ours, and it was safe, and for now that had to be enough. Max chattered about Captain Matthew while I made him dinner: boxed macaroni and cheese, the cheap kind that was mostly chemicals but filled his stomach. He'd formed an attachment to the Alpha after just a few hours, which both warmed and worried me. What happened when Matthew never called, never followed through? How would I explain to a 4-year-old that sometimes people made promises they didn't keep? That night, after Max fell asleep, I sat on our worn couch and stared at my phone. Matthew's business card sat on the coffee table in front of me, practically glowing in the dim lamplight. I picked it up, put it down, picked it up again. This was ridiculous. He'd given me his number out of politeness, not because he actually expected me to use it. Important Alphas like captains didn't want struggling single Omega parents calling them for help. That wasn't how the world worked. But his eyes had been so genuine, his offer so sincere. I went to bed without calling, but I dreamed of storm cloud eyes and hands that held mine steady through turbulence. And when I woke, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life had just shifted onto a completely different trajectory. 3 days passed in a blur of job applications and rejection emails, of stretching our food budget and trying not to panic about rent due in 2 weeks. And then my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. Unknown numbers were usually bill collectors or scam calls. But something made me hesitate. Some instinct I couldn't name. I swiped to Hello, Lonnie? It's Matthew. The world stopped. Everything around me faded. The sound of Max playing with his toy cars. The hum of our ancient refrigerator. The traffic noise from outside. Until all that existed was Matthew's voice in my ear. I didn't think you'd actually call, I managed. My voice embarrassingly breathless. I've been thinking about you and Max, he said, and there was that warmth again, the one that made me feel like melting. Are you free this evening? Why? Suspicion crept in automatically, a defensive reflex I'd developed over years of disappointment. Dinner. You and Max. Nothing fancy. I know a family diner with great burgers and a play area. I thought maybe we could talk, spend some time together. Would that be all right? My brain screamed at me to say no, to protect myself and Max from inevitable hurt. But my heart was already answering. What time? 6? I can pick you up. Just send me your address. After we hung up, I stood frozen in the middle of our tiny apartment, phone still clutched in my hand, trying to process what had just happened. Matthew had called. He'd actually followed through. And now he wanted to see us again. Max looked up from his cars. Who was that, Mama? Captain Matthew. He's invited us to dinner. Max's entire face lit up like Christmas morning. Really? Can we go? Please? How could I possibly say no to that expression? I spent the next 2 hours in a panic, trying to make our limited wardrobe presentable. Max had exactly 2 outfits that weren't stained or worn through. And I had even less. I finally settled on dark jeans and a simple green sweater that didn't have any holes, pulling my hair back into something resembling order. When the knock came at 6 exactly, my heart tried to escape through my throat. Matthew stood in the hallway wearing casual clothes, dark jeans and a navy button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. But his alpha presence was just as commanding as in uniform. Max immediately ran to him and Matthew scooped him up effortlessly, spinning him around until Max's laughter echoed through the hall. Ready? Matthew asked, setting Max down and looking at me with a smile that did dangerous things to my composure. The diner was perfect. A retro-style place with red vinyl booths and checkered floors. Music from the 50s playing softly in the background. Max ordered a cheeseburger and fries, his eyes huge with excitement. We didn't eat out often. Actually, we never ate out. Matthew ordered the same, then looked at me expectantly. I chose the cheapest thing on the menu, a grilled cheese, and tried not to think about how pathetic that probably seemed. Get what you actually want, Lonnie, Matthew said gently. Please. This is my Something about the way he said it without pity or condescension made me feel safe enough to order a real meal. When was the last time someone had taken care of me like this? While we waited for food, Matthew engaged Max in conversation about starting preschool, about his favorite toys, about what he wanted to be when he grew up. He listened to my son's rambling stories with genuine interest, asking follow-up questions, making Max feel heard and important. Watching them together created an ache in my chest I couldn't name. When the food arrived, Matthew waited until Max was thoroughly distracted by his burger before turning his full attention to me. I need to tell you something, Lonnie. I set down my fork, anxiety immediately spiking. Okay, that day on the plane when I first saw you. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Something happened to me. Your scent, the way you protected Max, the quiet strength you showed even when you were being treated unfairly. It all hit me like nothing ever has before. His eyes were intense, honest. I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since. I tried to convince myself it was just concern for a passenger, but I'd be lying. My breath caught. Matthew, I know trusting anyone, especially an alpha, is difficult for you. I understand why. You've been hurt, abandoned, treated like you don't matter. But I want to show you that not all alphas are the same. I want the chance to prove that someone can value you the way you deserve. Tears blurred my vision before I could stop them. Max was busy with his fries, oblivious to the moment happening across the table. Matthew reached across the table and took my hand. The same gentle, steady grip from the plane, as if I were something precious that required careful handling. I want to be part of your life, Lonnie. Yours and Max's. If you'll give me one chance, just one, I won't let you down. For years I protected my heart, built walls so high, nothing could penetrate them. But this alpha had somehow found every crack, every weakness, and was offering something I'd convinced myself didn't exist. Genuine care without conditions. "One chance," I whispered, my voice shaking. "But if you hurt us, I won't." The conviction in his voice left no room for doubt. "I promise you, Lonnie. I won't." He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his entire face, reaching those storm cloud eyes and making them shine, and squeezed my hand gently. Max looked up from his plate, ketchup on his chin, and grinned at seeing us holding hands. "Are you gonna be my mama's boyfriend, Captain Matthew?" Matthew laughed, a warm sound that wrapped around me like a blanket. "Would that be okay with you, Max?" "Yeah, you're cool." And just like that, something fundamental shifted in my world. I was terrified, absolutely terrified, but for the first time since Max's father had walked away, I felt something that almost resembled hope. Maybe my story didn't have to be one of constant struggle and loneliness. Maybe, just maybe, there could be a happy ending after all. We stayed at the diner for 2 hours, talking and laughing, Max getting sleepy against my side while Matthew told us stories about learning to fly, about places he'd traveled, about his own childhood. He asked about mine, and I found myself sharing things I normally kept locked away. Not the worst parts, not yet, but enough that he understood where I'd come from. When he drove us home, he walked us to our door like a gentleman from another era. "Can I see you again?" he asked. "Soon?" "Yes," I answered without hesitation. He leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to my forehead. Such a simple gesture, but it felt like a promise, and then he was gone, leaving me standing in my doorway with a sleeping child in my arms and a heart that was finally cautiously beginning to believe in possibilities.